Okay, thank you. So, appreciate everybody coming out. My name is Greg Moore. I'm the state director with Americans for Prosperity here in New Hampshire. We love celebrating this Pine Tree Riot event. We weren't able to do it last year. This is the 249th anniversary, so we felt it was critical that we have this event this year, because next year, of course, is going to be the 250th anniversary. Huge event. In the colonial times, the British government saw one great value in New Hampshire, and it was right below me: trees. Trees, and particularly white pine. You see, in the build-up, the British had pretty much deforested the British Isles. They made themselves a naval power on the back of wood, but then in so doing, they no longer had wood across most of England and the other British Isles. So when they had a chance to come to America and see these huge, pristine forest lands, they said, aha, this is what we wanted. And so what they valued the most was, of course, the white pine. The white pine was exactly a perfect material to make mast for trees. And so one of the things that they did was they said that the king owns, and this is starting in the late 17th century, they said the king owns any pine with a diameter of 24 inches or more. Now, we have Tom Thompson who will explain the significance of that and a 24-inch white pine. Well, in 1722, they decided, because they wanted to protect the seed stock, they took that 24 inches down to 12. And we have a graphic demonstration of the difference between a 24-inch white pine and a 12-inch below here. So you can see that the major difference. Now, the 24-inch wasn't a huge problem, largely because if you took it down a 24-inch white pine, trying to get it out of the forest was no easy task back then. We didn't have skidders back then. It was quite the challenge. So we went, and so when they shrunk it down to 12, now you really started to talk about what a lot of New Hampshire citizens were using as the basic building materials, the basic energy production. It was a critical element of everything that was part of the economy, part of housing, and part of society. And it was the most sought after stock that New Hampshire had. So white pine was the treasure crop that we had in this state. And so when they took it down in 1722 down to, they first tried to enforce this mandate, and they tried to enforce it once in a town called Brentwood, and the surveyor of the woods went out to go and found that yes, in fact, the people working the lumber yards were chopping down these white pines, and they decided to try to fine them for doing it. And a group of these gents got together and gave the surveyor a simple choice. Either he could leave and say nothing of it, or they would kill him. That's known as the Mast Tree Riot. And so there was this sort of happy, unenforced law on the books for about 50 years. No one paid any attention to it. Well, in 1771, there was, exactly, government was being very respectful back then. 1771, there was a new governor came along, and he decided he was leaving a lot of money on the table by not enforcing this law. And so in late 1771, he sent the surveyor down to 4 mills in Goffstown and 2 mills here in Weare, New Hampshire. And naturally, he found that there was plenty of white pines greater than 12 inches in the mill yards. And so he wrote it up. And then eventually they decided to send the Sheriff Whiting and his deputy to come and collect. In between this time, the mill owners who owned the 6 mills hired somebody to represent them. His name is Samuel Blodgett. He went up to the governor to try to make the case of the mills, and in turn, the governor actually hired the guy as a surveyor of the land. So the lawyer that they sent up to represent them actually turned coat, and then he suggested after he became the surveyor that they should just pay their fines. This is why lawyers get a bad name, though. I just want you to know. They sent out the sheriff and the deputy. Sheriff Whiting came out to go collect the debts. He went to the 4 Goffstown mills. They paid their debts. They went to the 2 mills here in Weare, owned by a fellow by the name of Ebenezer Mudgett, and he was having nothing of it. He said, no way. So they decided to arrest him. So they arrested Ebenezer Mudgett, but it was late in the evening. Remember, we weren't driving around with a paddy wagon here. It was late in the evening, and they didn't have the ability to get back home. So they said it was a house arrest, and they hoped that he would have a night to sleep on it, and he would just pay them in the morning. Well, instead, he had a little bit of a different strategy. His strategy instead was to round up a number of the town folk, came to his house, and they decided early the next morning, they showed up at Quimby's Inn, which would have been up on 114. And if you drive up 114, you'll see there's a big stone mill that represents the site of the Pine Tree Riot where Quimby's Inn was at the time. And they decided to break in and take the sheriff, proceed to hold him up and take switches and hit him one time for each log that he had claimed that had violated the king's order. They then took them out, the sheriff and the deputy out, tied them backwards to their horses and cut the horses' ears, mane, and tail, which would make one heck of a ride, and rode them right out of town. Now, that in and of itself would be historically significant, and I say this because it was actually organized. These people, it wasn't a spur of the moment thing like the Mass Tree Riot. These folks had time to think about it. They knew what they were doing, and they said that these people were unjustly taking our property. After that, the sheriff came and actually found a major and a captain, and they brought their battalions to come out as a posse. Now, there were estimated to be over 30 people who participated in the Pine Tree Riot, but they ended up only arresting 8. And the real significance of that, of the 8 people who had been arrested, they went before a panel of judges. And the panel of judges decided to give them a fine of 20 shillings, which is basically the equivalent of getting a parking ticket for nearly beating a sheriff and his deputy to death. And the significance of that is because the judges felt as though that this was unjust. The judges felt as though the actual order of the governor was unjust. And that is why they felt as though the penalty matched the crime. The significance of that is that the word of that traveled and circulated. Without that, the Boston Tea Party doesn't happen. Because the Boston Tea Party, they said, what's the worst they're going to do to us? Give us a 20 shilling fine? So no Pine Tree Riot, likely no Boston Tea Party. And this set forward a series of events that began the American Revolution. So that's why I think it's so critical that we commemorate the Pine Tree Riot. We put a lot of focus and energy about the history behind it that happened right here in Little Weare, New Hampshire. And I think it speaks, particularly nowadays, we think about the unjust laws that are being pushed upon us. I'm looking at Jeff Kibbe and thinking about his dealing with his local zoning board. and I can think of any number of more examples here of unjust laws that are being pushed upon us, and the need for citizens to take action and get involved and speak. And this is really your chance and your opportunity to make sure that these things don't continue to happen. We have to stand up for our rights, we have to stand up for our principles, and we have to stand up for the notion that we are a free people. And that is exactly what Ebenezer Mudgett did. That is the spirit of Ebenezer Mudgett, and that is why the Pine Tree Riot is a historic event, and that's why we celebrate it. Now with that, I want to turn it over to our freedom-loving guy. He's got even an axe to prove it, our chairman, Tom Thompson. But the beauty of Tom Thompson being our chair is he actually is a tree farmer. How serendipitous is it that you have a tree farmer who happens to be your honorary chairman? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Thompson.